I want to be honest with you about something before this story begins. The thing that started all of this was sidewalk chalk, not a legal dispute over property line, not an unauthorized structure that violated 17 sections of the community guidelines, not a noise complaint or a parking issue or any of the things that HOA conflicts are usually about when they get to the level of documented violations and formal proceedings. It was chalk. The washable kind that comes in a plastic bucket with 40 colors, and that costs $11 at the pharmacy, and that my daughter Emma, who was 7 years old at the time, had used on the public sidewalk in front of our house to draw a rainbow and a sun and a collection of figures that she told me were our family, but that, in the honest visual assessment of a parent who loves his child completely and her artistic talent provisionally, looked more like a collection of potatoes with limbs. It rained the next day. The chalk was gone. What was not gone, what persisted long after the rainbow and the sun and the potato people had washed away, was the violation notice that Teresa Carmichael, the president of the Fernwood Lakes HOA, had issued against my property for the chalk. And what persisted even longer than the violation notice was my response to it, which took approximately 6 weeks to fully execute and which produced something that the town of Fernwood Lakes is still talking about 2 years later, and which I am, without any false modesty, genuinely proud of in a way that I have not been proud of many things in my adult life. But I need to give you the context because the chalk was not the beginning. The chalk was the match. The kindling had been accumulating for 3 years. My name is Brian Calloway. I am 41 years old. I am a marketing consultant. I work for myself, have for 8 years, and my particular specialty is brand identity and experiential marketing, which means I spend my professional life thinking about how spaces and objects and events communicate messages and how those messages land with the people who receive them. I mention this because it is directly relevant to the response I eventually chose, and because the response I chose was not random or impulsive, but was the product of the same professional toolkit I use for clients applied to a situation that had become personal enough to deserve my full creative attention. I moved to Fernwood Lakes with my wife Rachel and our daughter Emma, then 4 years old, 3 years before the chalk incident. We had chosen Fernwood Lakes specifically for the qualities that make neighborhoods like it appealing to families: good schools, safe streets, a community feel, neighbors who knew each other's names. The HOA had seemed, in our pre-purchase research, like a standard community governance organization. It maintained the common areas, organized the annual neighborhood events, and kept a reasonable set of community standards that seemed designed for shared benefit rather than individual control. Teresa Carmichael had been HOA president for 2 years before we moved in and was in her 3rd year when we arrived. She was a precise, organized woman in her early 60s who had brought to the HOA presidency the energy of someone who had recently retired from a career in hospital administration and who had found, in the community governance role, a new arena for the organizational drive that had defined her professional life. She was good at the administrative aspects of the job, the financials were impeccable, the common area maintenance was thorough, the governing documents were the most organized I had seen in any HOA community. As a pure administrator, she was excellent. As a neighbor, she was exhausting. The first notice arrived 8 months after we moved in. It concerned the potted plants on our front porch, specifically the fact that we had 4 potted plants on the porch and the community guidelines permitted a maximum of 3 visible potted plants in the front of the property. I counted the plants. We had 4. I moved 1 to the backyard. I sent documentation. Teresa sent a compliance acknowledgement. The second notice arrived 4 months later. It concerned the color of our front door, which we had repainted when we moved in. The color we had chosen was a particular shade of blue. Rachel had selected it from a paint store sample book, and it was, in the context of our gray-sided house, genuinely beautiful. Notice said the color was not on the HOA's approved exterior color palette, a document that had not been provided to us at the time of our purchase and that I had not known existed. I reviewed the palette. The color was not on it, technically, though a shade approximately 3 points lighter on the same paint chip was on the list, which seemed to me a distinction without a meaningful difference. I repainted the door the approved shade. The result was nearly indistinguishable from what we had before. Teresa sent a compliance acknowledgement. Over the following 2 years, I received 7 more violation notices. A holiday wreath left up 2 days past the HOA's permitted holiday decoration window. A section of lawn that had dried unevenly during a drought summer and that Teresa had photographed and cited as inadequately maintained. A basketball hoop I had installed in the driveway that required prior approval I had not sought. A delivery pallet that had sat beside the garage for 3 days while I arranged its disposal. A car belonging to a houseguest that had been parked on the street for more than the permitted 72-hour window for single-vehicle guest parking. A garden flag Rachel had put out for spring that was, at 11 inches by 15 inches, 1 inch wider than the permitted flag dimensions in the front yard. And a bird bath I had installed in the front garden bed that Teresa had determined constituted an unauthorized water feature. The bird bath, a concrete bird bath 20 inches tall, holding approximately 3 gallons of water that the community guidelines apparently categorized as a water feature subject to prior approval. I had moved it to the backyard. I had sent documentation. I had received a compliance acknowledgement. I had stood in my kitchen afterward, looking at the space where the bird bath had been, and felt the particular grinding exhaustion of a person who is not doing anything wrong, but is constantly being told they are. Rachel had a phrase for the experience. She said it felt like living in a house that wasn't quite yours. Like every choice you made about the space was provisional, subject to review, potentially wrong in ways you had not anticipated and would be notified about in a formal letter with a compliance window. She said she had stopped wanting to do things to the house because every time she did something it turned into a notice and a photograph and a compliance acknowledgement and an entry in the HOA's file on our property. She said she was tired. I was tired too. Then Emma drew her rainbow and her potato family on the sidewalk, and it rained, and the chalk was gone in 14 hours, but the violation notice arrived 3 days later. The notice cited Section 12, Paragraph F of the Fernwood Lakes Community Standards, which addressed public-facing surfaces of homeowner properties and prohibited the application of any paint, chalk, adhesive, or similar material to public sidewalks adjacent to homeowner properties. The provision had been added, I discovered when I looked into its history, 2 years earlier in an amendment that Teresa had pushed through citing concerns about neighborhood aesthetic consistency. Sidewalk chalk applied by a child to the public sidewalk in front of the house was, under this provision, a violation subject to a fine of $50 for a first occurrence and $100 for subsequent occurrences. I read the notice. I read it again. I looked at the photograph Teresa had attached to the notice, a photograph of Emma's chalk drawing, which had already been raining away when the picture was taken, the colors fading at the edges, the potato people beginning to dissolve. The photograph showed something a child had made with joy and that the rain was already erasing, and that was going to be completely gone within hours. $50. I set the notice down on the kitchen table, and I sat with it for a long time. What I felt was not primarily anger, though anger was present. What I felt, underneath and around the anger, was something more like decision. The specific quality of decision that arrives when a person who has been patient has reached the point where patience is no longer the appropriate response to the situation. I had been patient for 3 years. I had trimmed the plants, repainted the door, moved the bird bath, taken down the wreath on schedule, addressed every notice, sent every photograph, received every compliance acknowledgement. I had been a cooperative, responsive, by-the-book homeowner in a community whose president treated the community guidelines as a personal instrument for managing people she found insufficiently organized. A 7-year-old's sidewalk chalk drawing. In the rain. I was not going to pay the fine. I was not going to accept the violation. And I was not going to do either of those things through the usual channel of a formal challenge that would take months and produce a grudging withdrawal if I was lucky. I was going to do something else, something that used the public sidewalk in front of my house in a way that was not covered by Section 12, Paragraph F, because Section 12 Paragraph F addressed the application of paint, chalk, adhesive, or similar material by homeowners. It said nothing about professional art. It said nothing about commissioned work. It said nothing about what happened when a homeowner, rather than applying chalk to the sidewalk themselves, hired a professional artist to create a work on a public surface. A surface that was, I had confirmed with the County Public Works Department, municipal property over which the HOA had no direct jurisdiction, even if the HOA's guidelines attempted to regulate homeowner activity on it. I had been thinking about this distinction for 2 days when I called a former client of mine, a woman named Dana who ran an arts organization in the city and who was, in the professional world I inhabited, one of the most connected people I knew when it came to artists and creative talent. I explained the situation, the chalk notice, the HOA, the sidewalk, what I was thinking about doing. Dana listened, and then she said, "I know exactly who you need to talk to." The person Dana put me in touch with was a man named Marco Ferretti. Marco was 37 years old, Italian-born, trained at an art institute in Florence, and had spent the previous decade developing one of the most technically sophisticated practices in the field of anamorphic 3D pavement art in the country. If you are not familiar with anamorphic 3D pavement art, it is the technique by which an artist, working on a flat surface with the physics of perspective and the geometry of the viewer's position, creates an image that appears, from a specific viewing angle, to be three-dimensional. When it is done at the level that Marco did it, the result is not merely impressive. It is genuinely disorienting in the best possible way. Your brain processes what your eyes are showing it and insists that what you are seeing is real, a hole in the ground or a canyon or structure rising from the pavement, and the distance between what you know intellectually and what you perceive visually is the thing that stops people in their tracks and makes them reach for their phones and share it with everyone they know. Marco had created large-scale pavement installations in cities across North America and Europe. His work had been photographed by millions of people, shared across every social platform, covered by local and national media. He was not, in any sense, an unknown. He was a genuine artist with a genuine reputation and the specific combination of technical skill and creative vision that produces work that people travel to see. I called Marco. I explained who I was and what I was thinking and where and why. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me to send him the violation notice. I sent it to him, he read it, he called me back and said he was in. We discussed the concept for about 2 weeks. The sidewalk in front of my house ran along the full width of the property, approximately 40 feet, and there was a generous section between the sidewalk and the street that was within the municipal right-of-way. Marco said the full area gave him enough surface to do something significant. He said he had a specific idea. The idea was a trompe l'oeil, an optical illusion, of a massive crack in the earth running along the length of the sidewalk in front of my house, with the crack descending into a seemingly bottomless chasm filled with luminous water and illuminated coral formations. The surface of the water would appear to be 6 inches below the sidewalk level, with the coral and the depths below appearing to extend another 20 feet down. The visual effect, from the optimal viewing angle that Marco would mark on the sidewalk for visitors, would be complete, a section of public sidewalk that appeared to be a window into an underwater world. He said it would take him and his 2 assistants 3 days to complete. I asked about materials. He said the work would be done in chalk-based outdoor paints, technically different from the chalk Emma had used in the sense that they were artist-grade pigments in a chalk base designed for pavement application, but similar in the critical sense that they were water-soluble and would be completely removed by rain, typically within 2 to 3 weeks of heavy weather. The medium was ephemeral by design. The art would exist for a period, and then it would be gone, and the sidewalk would be exactly as it had been. I asked whether the chalk-based outdoor paints would constitute the same kind of material as was addressed in Teresa's violation notice. Marco said from his experience with municipal permissions and property regulations, professional pavement art in chalk-based media was treated differently from casual chalk application in most jurisdictions because it was a form of temporary public art rather than casual property marking. He said the distinction was recognized in most municipal arts ordinances. He also said that since the sidewalk was public property rather than HOA property, the HOA's guidelines about homeowner application of chalk to the sidewalk were of questionable applicability to a professional artist working on a public surface at the invitation of a homeowner. I had confirmed this independently with Robert Chin, my attorney, before our conversation. Robert had reviewed Section 12, Paragraph F, and had said the provision applied to homeowners applying material to the sidewalk, not to professional artists commissioned to create temporary public art. He had also confirmed that the sidewalk was municipal property over which the HOA had regulatory authority only insofar as the HOA's guidelines could bind homeowner conduct on the sidewalk, not professional third-party artists not bound by the HOA's homeowner agreements. I told Marco to plan the installation. I pulled the required municipal permit for temporary public art installation from the city's Parks and Public Spaces office, a straightforward permit that cost $40 and required a description of the work, the artist's credentials, and confirmation that the materials were temporary and reversible. The permit was approved in 8 days. I also, because I am a marketing consultant, and because the professional habit of thinking about how things land in the world does not stop when the project is personal, sent a press release to the local newspaper, the community's social media groups, and 3 regional arts coverage publications. The press release announced that a nationally recognized pavement artist would be creating a large-scale temporary anamorphic installation on Fernwood Lake's Clearwater Drive beginning on a Friday and would be available for viewing through the weekend and into the following week. It included Marco's credentials and a link to his portfolio. It did not mention the HOA or Teresa Carmichael or the violation notice. It was a straightforward arts announcement. The local newspaper's arts correspondent called me the afternoon after the press release went out. The installation began on a Friday morning. Marco arrived at 7 a.m. on Friday with his 2 assistants, a young woman named Priya and a man named Diego, both of whom were themselves accomplished artists working in Marco's studio. They arrived in a van loaded with materials, chalk-based paints in approximately 40 colors, brushes and applicators of every size, a grid system for laying out the geometric framework of the anamorphic design, reference photographs, and the particular focused energy of people who are about to spend 3 days executing something technically demanding. I brought them coffee and then stayed out of their way, which is the correct approach when professionals are working. The first day was foundation work, the geometric grid that would govern the entire composition, the blocking in of the major shapes, the establishment of the horizon line, and the viewing point that would make the 3-dimensional illusion function. From above, from any angle other than the specific optimal viewing position, the work in progress looked like an abstract arrangement of shapes in pale colors. The mathematics of anamorphic art is the mathematics of constructing something that only becomes itself when seen from a specific position, and everything about the first day's work was in service of that eventual coherence. I went about my day, answered emails, had a client call, made lunch for Emma when she came home from school. Emma came out to the sidewalk after school and watched Marco and Priya and Diego work for a while. Marco explained to her, in simple terms, what they were doing and why the shapes that looked random from above would look like a hole in the ground from the corner of the street. Emma said that sounded like magic. Marco said it was basically geometry, and then thought about it for a moment and said actually it was basically magic. The neighbors began appearing on Friday afternoon, not in large numbers, a few people walking past who stopped to watch, a couple from 3 houses down who stood for 10 minutes asking Marco questions. Word was moving through the neighborhood, but slowly, at the pace that word moves when it is traveling through person-to-person conversations rather than through any organized channel. Saturday was different. The newspaper article had run in the Friday evening edition, not a front-page story, but a genuine feature in the arts section, with a photograph of Marco at work and a description of the installation that included the viewing angle and what the finished work was expected to look like. The social media post in the Fernwood Lakes community group had been shared 47 times by Friday evening. By Saturday morning, people who did not live on Clearwater Drive were driving to it. Marco and his team worked through Saturday with an audience that grew steadily from morning to afternoon. By noon, there were perhaps 30 people on the sidewalk at various points along the installation area, watching the work develop, photographing it at various stages of completion, asking questions. Marco was, I discovered, an extraordinarily gracious presence under public attention. He answered every question fully, explained the technique to everyone who wanted to understand it, posed for photographs with residents and visitors, and maintained throughout the quality of calm focus that a person develops when they have spent a decade creating work in public spaces. By Saturday afternoon, the underwater chasm was visible. Not complete, the coral formations were not fully rendered, the depth gradations in the water had not been finished, but the essential illusion was present. People who stood at the optimal viewing position and looked at what had been flat sidewalk that morning were seeing what appeared to be a window opening in the earth, lit from below, descending into blue-green water and the beginning of a coral world beneath. The reaction of most people to this was a specific, involuntary sound, a quick intake of breath, a soft exclamation, sometimes a laugh, followed by stepping forward and then stepping back, testing the distance, checking whether the illusion changed, sharing the viewing position with whoever they were with. I stood at my front door and watched this happen all Saturday afternoon, and I felt something that I want to try to describe accurately because it is the thing about this experience that I remember most clearly. It was not triumph. It was not the satisfaction of having beaten Teresa Carmichael at something. Those feelings were present in a small way, but they were not what I felt most. What I felt most was something about community, about what a community is, actually, as opposed to what an HOA is. An HOA is an administrative structure. It has bylaws and guidelines and compliance windows and violation notices and formal acknowledgements. It is organized around rules and their enforcement. A community is something different. A community is what happens when people share a space and find reasons to be in it together and to make things in it and to look at things together and to feel, for a moment, the particular pleasure of sharing an experience with strangers who happen to be neighbors. What was happening on the sidewalk in front of my house on Saturday afternoon was community in the real sense. People who did not know each other were standing next to each other looking at something beautiful and surprising and finding it worth talking about. Parents were lifting small children to see. Elderly residents who had walked to the viewing point were explaining to younger ones what the technique was called. A group of teenagers who had arrived on bikes were lying on the pavement at the viewing angle to get the optimal perspective for their photographs, laughing at the result. Emma stood next to me at the front door and watched all of it. She was 7 years old and she understood, I think, more of it than her vocabulary could express at the time. After a while she said, "Daddy, is this because of my chalk?" I said yes, in a way it was. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm glad I drew the rainbow." I said I was glad too. Teresa Carmichael appeared on Saturday afternoon at approximately 3 p.m. I saw her from the front door. She came around the corner of Clearwater Drive on foot, apparently having heard about the installation through the same channels as everyone else, and she stopped at the edge of the crowd that had gathered near the viewing point. She was not immediately visible to me as the HOA president or as the person who had sent the chalk notice. She looked from a distance like any other person who had come to see what the crowd was looking at. She stepped into the viewing position and looked at the installation. I watched her look at it. I watched her face do what everyone's face did in that position, the processing, the recalibration, the moment of the illusion landing. She stood there for what I estimated was about 30 seconds. Then she turned and saw me at the front door and held eye contact for a moment before looking away and moving back through the crowd. She left without speaking to me. I did not attempt to speak to her. Marco and his team finished the installation on Sunday afternoon. The completed work was, and I say this not as the person who commissioned it, but as someone who spent a weekend watching several hundred people encounter it, genuinely extraordinary. The coral formations had been completed in detail that rewarded close examination, individual branches of staghorn and brain coral, fish that appeared to be moving in the current, a shaft of light descending from the surface of the water that was positioned to interact with the actual afternoon sun falling on the sidewalk, so that the light in the painting and the light in reality briefly aligned at around 4 p.m. The depth of the chasm, which appeared to extend 20 feet below the sidewalk surface, was convincing enough that more than one person told me they had experienced a moment of vertigo when they first stepped into the viewing position. Marco signed the work at the bottom right corner of the composition, a small signature in white paint with the date. He shook my hand and thanked me for the commission. I thanked him for the work. He and Priya and Diego loaded their van and drove away. By Monday morning, the Fernwood Lakes installation had been covered by 2 regional television stations, the state's major newspaper arts section, and 3 national arts and culture websites. Marco's portfolio page linked to the installation. The viewing point had a small line at peak times. Residents of neighboring communities were driving to Clearwater Drive to see it. The local tourism office, which I had not contacted, called me on Monday afternoon to ask if I could provide photography for their regional attractions page. I provided photography. They published it. The installation remained visible for 9 days before the first significant rain. I watched it fade over 2 days of steady October rain, the colors dissolving, the shapes blurring, the coral and the chasm softening and running until the sidewalk was washed clean and flat and ordinary again. The process of its disappearance was, I found, almost as beautiful as the installation itself. The way the colors moved in the water, the way the shapes lost their edges and became abstract before they became nothing. On the 10th day after the rain, the sidewalk was clean. It looked exactly as it had before Marco arrived. The permit was closed. The municipality sent a letter acknowledging completion of the temporary installation and thanking me for bringing public art to the neighborhood. I still had not paid the chalk fine. I had filed a formal challenge to the violation notice the week before the installation began. Robert had prepared the challenge on procedural and substantive grounds, arguing that the provision's application to a child's temporary chalk drawing on public property was an overreach of the HOA's authority and that the provision itself was legally fragile given the public nature of the sidewalk. The challenge was pending. Teresa withdrew the violation notice 6 days after the installation began. The withdrawal came without a hearing, without any formal proceeding, without any communication from Teresa personally. It came as a single document from the HOA management company stating that the violation notice for the chalk incident had been reviewed and withdrawn and that no fine was owed. It gave no reason for the withdrawal. Robert said the withdrawal was clean and complete and that there was nothing further to pursue. He said he thought the timing of the withdrawal was probably not coincidental. I said I thought probably not either. The community response to the installation produced a secondary effect that I had not planned for, but that I think was its most lasting consequence. In the weeks following the installation, the Fernwood Lakes Community Social Media Group had an extended conversation about the HOA's community standards, specifically about the chalk provision and several other recently added restrictions that residents had found similarly heavy-handed. The conversation was substantive and organized, and it led, approximately 6 weeks after the installation, to a community petition requesting that the HOA board review and revise the chalk provision and several related restrictions on homeowner expression in outdoor spaces. The petition had 112 signatures from Fernwood Lakes homeowners, which was 41% of the community's households. Teresa responded to the petition with a board meeting scheduled for the following month. The meeting was well attended, 34 homeowners, the largest turnout at a community meeting since the community was founded according to the board's records. The discussion was substantive. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to form a guidelines review committee, including homeowner representatives, to assess the chalk provision and the related restrictions. The committee met 3 times over the following 2 months and produced a set of recommendations that the board adopted largely intact. The chalk provision was revised. The new language permitted temporary chalk artwork on public sidewalks adjacent to homeowner properties by residents or their family members, subject to a prohibition on obscene or offensive content, and a requirement that the artwork not block accessibility access on the sidewalk. The revision also created a carve-out for professionally commissioned temporary public art, which was recognized as a community enrichment activity not subject to the HOA's homeowner conduct guidelines. The birdbath was also addressed indirectly in the revision. The water feature definition was narrowed to exclude decorative non-recirculating water elements under 30 gallons in capacity, which meant birdbaths of the type Rachel and I had installed were no longer subject to prior approval. I reinstalled the birdbath in the front garden bed in the spring following the revision. The birds returned within 2 weeks. Emma named 2 of the regular visitors, a pair of house sparrows she called Spark and Crumble, names that I chose not to question because the internal logic of a 7-year-old's naming decisions is not something that benefits from adult scrutiny. Spark and Crumble use the birdbath daily when the weather is right. Emma checks on them in the morning before school. The front door is still the blue Rachel had originally chosen, the approved shade, which is very nearly indistinguishable from the one we wanted and which looks, in the morning light on our grey-sided house, exactly right. Teresa Carmichael served out the remaining 14 months of her term after the installation. She did not run for re-election. The new HOA president was a man named William who had been on the Guidelines Review Committee and who brought to the role the perspective of someone who had seen, from the inside, how the previous approach had worked and was committed to a different one. William ran the HOA as though the guidelines existed for the residents rather than the other way around. The common areas continued to be maintained well because Teresa had been genuinely good at that part, and the violation notices became considerably less frequent and more genuinely warranted when they did appear. I received 1 violation notice in the 2 years of William's presidency. It was for an oil stain on the driveway that had been there for 6 months and that I had in fact been planning to address and simply had not gotten around to. The notice was polite and the compliance window was generous, and I addressed the stain within the window and received a compliance acknowledgement. The whole thing took 10 days and produced no particular feeling in either direction. It was, in other words, exactly what an HOA violation notice should be: a practical communication about a genuine issue, addressed practically, forgotten quickly. Marco Ferretti has been back to Fernwood Lakes once since the installation, at my invitation, for a community arts event that William organized in the 2nd year of his presidency. Marco gave a talk in the community clubhouse about anamorphic art and technique to about 60 residents. Emma sat in the front row. After the talk, she went up to Marco and showed him on her phone a photograph she had taken during the installation, a photograph she had taken herself from the optimal viewing position the moment the illusion had fully clicked into place for her the first time she saw it. Marco looked at the photograph. He said it was a very good photograph. She said she had taken it herself. He said she had a good eye. She said she was going to be an artist. He said that sounded right. She has since moved from sidewalk chalk to watercolors, which she applies in our kitchen on weekend mornings with a focused concentration that reminds me of Marco and his team on the first day of the installation, working with careful attention on a foundation that would eventually become something else. The paintings cover the refrigerator and 2 walls of her bedroom. Some of them are, in the honest assessment of a parent who loves his daughter fully and her artistic talent with increasing sincerity, genuinely good. None of them have received a violation notice. Thumbnail text. Line 1, HOA Karen threatened to fine me over my daughter's sidewalk chalk, so I hired a world-class 3D artist the whole town came to see. Line 2, hundreds of people showed up, TV stations covered it, and Karen withdrew the fine without a single word artist palette.